So welcome. I'm Prerna Singh, a professor of political science and international studies, and a member of the steering committee of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia. And on behalf of Professor Shahzad Bashir and myself, I am at once both humbled and thrilled to introduce these incredible, inspiring individuals here to you. Each of our distinguished panelists deserves the most extensive and fulsome of introductions. And together, they have both cast a new light on those multiple grave challenges facing our times and our region in particular, which we have been hearing so brilliantly but soberingly articulated by this morning's panels and also by yesterday. But in addition to pushing us actively to think, returning to Professor Mehta's evocation of Mr. Saxena's inaugural remarks about these difficult issues with a specific eye towards marginalization and inclusion, our panel today, through their words, their vision, their voice, they have given us moments of reflection, of contemplation, and of thinking in peace. I think of Vikram Doctor, who I have read for so many years now, whose writings have shaped how we think of the history, the production, and the role of food in Indian society and culture and beyond, and also its sustainability in the future, given climate change, a grave shared challenge that we have not really discussed. I also think of Vikram's tireless, inspiring work to abolish Article 377, which was the 18-year-long struggle to decriminalize homosexuality in India. I think of Manjushree Thapa, of her award-winning novels of the themes of loss, identity, of strength, but also solidarity, that are so elegantly and skillfully set against the politics and history of Nepal, in the tutor of history, and all of us in our own lives, of her own non-fiction writing, including The Lives We Have Lost, a moving collection of her reportage and editorials on Nepal's Maoist war and peace process. I think of The Boy from Siklis, a biography of her mentor, the groundbreaking environmentalist Chandra Gurung. And in addition to her own words, which have been translated themselves into French, German, Finnish, Italian, Japanese, and Nepali, she has, as a literary translator of Nepali works into English, brought the words, and in doing so, the worlds of others, particularly Nepali writers, to us. I think, of course, of Marina Tabassum, winner of almost every prestigious architectural award, including Lifetime Achievement Awards. I think of her oeuvre, contemporary yet reflectively rooted to place, engaging with climate, context, culture, history. Her Aga Khan Architectural Award-winning Bet-ur-Ruf Mosque, built over several years with a teeny budget, shorn of all expected mosque iconography, foregrounding materiality and light, a space built not just for worship, but a home for an underserved community in the periphery of Dhaka, that most, in Mushfiq and statistical terms, the most unlivable of cities on our increasingly unlivable planet. And I think, finally, of the one and only Ali Sethi, beyond the lyrical intensity and melody of Pasuri. Ashu mentioned Ali's editorial with Pankaj Mishra in The Guardian. I think also of The Wishmaker that I bought so many years ago, a pirated copy at a traffic light in Delhi. It's the ultimate symbol of success in South Asia, is if your book is pirated and sold for like 100 rupees. A first-rate novel, the New York Times' words, not mine, which has been translated into Italian, Dutch, German, Chinese, and Turkish, and in a final concluding hopeful signal that pan-South Asian solidarity that we all crave and have been calling for, also into Hindi. So with that, I turn over to this distinguished set of panelists, and thank you again for joining us today.
Okay, so yeah, post-lunch is always the hard slot. Everybody's like sleepy, so we might as well talk a little bit more about food, and and hope people don't go further to sleep. I want to say, I'm really thankful to the Saxena Center, to Prerna, and for inviting me, and to my really old friend Holly Schaefer from Brown, who has helped bring my name into this discussion, because what I'm here to talk about, food writing and the growth of food studies, is relatively new as a discipline in itself. And it's not something that normally features in sort of conversations and spaces like this. And I'm really honored that I've been asked to speak and bring in this subject. And I should say why I started writing about food. I mean, about 25 years back, simply because for me, food was a way to start conversations with people of all kinds. And yesterday, in his address, when Mr. Saxena said that he, donated the money for the center to encourage a place where people could think and to have conversations with each other. I mean, that resonated very deeply with me because to me, food is one way that you can have a conversation with anybody. And it's a way to have conversations with people who are normally left out of conversations. Women, older women in particular, who have always been marginalized in India, but who are the ones in whose hands food production has been left a lot. There are ways there have been initiatives, for instance, like there was an amazing initiative called the Dharavi Biennale, which was set up to encourage arts and projects coming out from Dharavi, the biggest slum in Mumbai. And one person, Prerna Singh, who was asked to do a project, she was trying to encourage conversations from the women who were very reluctant to talk because nobody had listened to them, nobody ever talked to them in their lives. And finally, she got them to start cooking. And she produced an extraordinary book, and we were just talking to Holly about it yesterday. It's with a very funny title. It's called The Indecisive Chicken. And it's a book that showcases the lives of 8 women from Dharavi through the food that they make. It's an extraordinary book. And to me, that's the way food helps us open up conversations. It even helps us open up conversations with people who literally cannot speak. And again, this is something I've been working on recently. Because I wrote about an amazing place that has opened up recently in Chennai called the Museum of Possibilities. And the Museum of Possibilities is actually a showcase of technologies for the differently abled. And again, I wanted to mention this because this session is about marginalization. And again, the differently abled are the most literally marginalized in South Asia all the time. Their needs, their problems hardly ever feature in these sort of discussions. And again, food came up in very fascinating ways because I was speaking to, because a lot of the technologies were about, how to adapt kitchens and how to adapt, your living conditions and things like that, but also about language. Again, we were talking earlier about disappearing languages. The language that nobody ever talks about is Indian Sign Language. I mean, how many of us are even aware of the histories of Indian Sign Language, which is actually relatively recent? What I've been able to learn is that up till about 2000, there were multiple dialects of Indian Sign Language, which post 2000 have started coming together and coming to create, one single sign language, a bit on the lines of ASL, but it has received none of the support that, say, ASL has received. I mean, the way ASL is being integrated into, places like, television or universities or places like that in the US is something you will never see. I have never seen a politician in India who will share space with an ISL, signer. And the person I was speaking to, who is somebody who's worked a lot with the development of ISL, gave me a fascinating example of the sort of changes. She told me that how the word for vegetable has changed. Originally, one of the main words for vegetable was like this. Now, can anybody here, since ISL usually has a source in something physical, why would this be the word for vegetable? Exactly, the fixed blade knife. The fixed blade knife, which is such a fundamental part of so many South Asian cuisines, that which again is so different from the West. The West, where the idea of a fixed blade knife, doesn't exist. Whereas it's very fundamental to many traditional South Asian cuisines. So it's called the bonti in Bengal and similar terms, and which is why the older term for cutting vegetables was this. But the thing is, the fixed blade knife is disappearing. It's disappearing from Indian culture because the knowledge of how to use a fixed blade knife is vanishing. I mean, Chitrita Banerjee has written a fascinating essay about this, about the changes in kitchens and the changes in the lives of women that is making a fixed blade knife disappear. And that is also mirrored in sign language. So actually the term for sign language in Indian Sign Language now for vegetable is, which is the modern shopping. So we've gone from this to this. And to me, this is an example of how, talking about food brings in all kinds of conversations, all kinds of marginalizations. And, again, because the way food studies brings in so many different disciplines is something that is really being appreciated relatively recently. I thought I should give you one example, again, from something I wrote about quite recently. One of the most popular foods, which is tandoori chicken. Tandoori chicken, again, has been in the news because, 75 years of independence means, unfortunately, 75 years of partition. And tandoori chicken is often spoken about as one of the few things that came out of partition, which was relatively positive. And everybody knows the story that is put out by places like Moti Mahal, that how refugees coming from near Afghanistan, from the Northwest Frontier Province, bought the tandoors, which are these sort of clay ovens sunk into the earth, which are used across Central Asia. They got them to Delhi and started putting chickens in them, and suddenly you had tandoori chicken. This is the standard story that is told by everybody. But to me, the story is a bit more complicated than that, because number one, there were tandoors in northern India earlier. Because it's not like partition was the first reason why people started coming from those areas towards Delhi. So there were tandoors earlier. What changed? What brought things together to create tandoori chicken at that particular point of time? Well, obviously, chickens are one thing. Now, chickens are have a very fascinating and slightly odd history in Indian cuisine, in Indian history, because they probably descend from the Indian red jungle fowl, which is native to India. But they're curiously absent from the sort of historical record. And, there are different theories about it. One theory is that because they're scavengers, they were probably seen as unclean. So many Indian communities didn't eat chicken, and it's true that the major domestication of chicken happened in Southeast Asia, on one side in Persia, on the other side, outside India, even though the bird actually originates from India or Northeast India, more likely. So the chicken farming really comes back to India with the British in a big way. The British are the ones who really promote chicken farming for a very simple reason. Once they built a network of dark bungalows, the sort of bungalows where anybody could stop and stay, spend a night, they needed an easy source of meat because, of course, being British, they had to have meat. And for that reason, they encouraged the dark bungalows to start poultry farming, because, you see, it was too expensive to kill a goat or have goats ready just in case somebody comes, but a chicken could easily be killed when somebody came. I mean, it became so common that, the joke was that one of the standard dishes was called sudden death, because somebody would come, there'd be a frantic squawking, and then a chicken would be ready for your meal. The other advantage of having chickens was that you had eggs, so the next day he would be able to have eggs for breakfast. Most important of all, he could have caramel custard for dessert. One reason why caramel custard is this ubiquitous Indian dessert is because the British promoted poultry farming and eggs. So yes, there were chickens, but they were pretty tough chickens. Okay, I mean, the dark bungalow chicken was notorious for being like almost inedible. And again, everybody thinks of chickens today in terms of broiler chickens, but broiler chickens didn't exist in India at that time. I mean, actually, it's interesting that we're here in Rhode Island, because this is actually the area where broiler chickens come from. So not so much Rhode Island, though Rhode Island's native bird, bizarrely enough, is a chicken. Rhode Island and Delaware are two states that have chickens, different types of chickens as their state birds. But actually, it's in Delaware, where almost exactly 100 years back, in 1923, the story is that there was this farmer's wife who had ordered 50 chicks. And at that time, birds were raised for eggs, and then once they were old and fairly tough, they were killed. So the ways of cooking them were usually stewing them. But instead of getting 50 chicks, she got 500 chicks. It was like a mailing mistake. So stuck with 500 chicks, she decided to raise them. And very crucially, supply them to New York, where suddenly a new market for chickens had developed because New York in the 1920s was being flooded by immigrants, both African Americans from the southern states and Jewish and and European immigrants from Europe. Both these communities, neither of them wealthy, wanted meat. Chicken was actually the ideal meat, especially for the Jewish communities, because the chickens could be brought live to the city and slaughtered in front of them in a kosher way. So suddenly, this huge demand for chickens developed in New York and cities on the eastern seaboard. And the farmers in the Delmarva Peninsula, basically, where Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia meet, developed this industry in broiler chickens. And that's pretty much how the broiler chicken industry developed in the 1920s and 1930s. But these chickens, broiler chickens, were not available in India at that time. They only really come to India after specific allocation is made for poultry farming in the second five-year plan. And that's when India's huge, now gigantic, and very controversial, chicken industry develops. So what was available for Moti Mahal and for all the restaurateurs who came over partition were these pretty tough chickens. And this is where actually the Moti Mahal, probably Kundanlal Gujral of Moti Mahal, did actually play a key role. He marinated it in dahi, in yogurt. And this is the thing about tandoori chicken. The real key to tandoori chicken is yogurt. It's not so much the chicken, it's the yogurt marinade, which tenderizes and makes the chicken juicy. And a last piece of the puzzle fell into place for me from Madhur Jafri, because she writes in her memoir that the one big change, because Madhur comes from a very old Delhi Kayast family, and she says that the one big change that she remembers from partition was that Punjabis came with water buffaloes. And suddenly water buffalo milk became widely available, and water buffalo milk products became widely available in Delhi. It's not that there were no water buffaloes earlier, but water buffaloes have a very curious reputation. They are fundamental to Asia, to South Asia, to milk products, but they're looked down on, particularly for obvious reasons, because the cows are prioritized. Water buffaloes are seen as inferior. But Punjabis came with their herds of Mara and Neeli Ravi water buffaloes and started making water buffalo milk and water buffalo milk products available. This water buffalo, particularly for dahi. And this dahi was what was used for tandoori chicken. So it's amazing, all these facets come together. And to me, this is what. Sorry. So this is an example of the sort of stories how food writing can bring together many stories, can bring together hidden stories. I mean, again, I've been given 15 minutes left, but I'm going to spend 1 minute on water buffaloes because I'm personally very fond of water buffaloes. I write about water buffaloes a lot. I could spend the next 15 minutes talking about water buffaloes, but I won't. But I will just say this, that, South Asia is actually a land of the water buffalo in all its countries. Cows are being pushed down our necks, cows are being prioritized for political reasons, but Amul's whole success was built on water buffalo, something Amul is now conveniently forgetting. Water buffaloes are important in Pakistan, in Punjab, in Sri Lanka recently. I mean, that amazing kitul and yogurt, water buffalo yogurt is the quintessential Sri Lankan dessert. And recently, just this year, something only water buffalo enthusiasts like me would have noticed was that a specific species of water buffalo was identified genetically in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has water buffaloes. Bangladesh had a growing water buffalo population because it's suited for physically for Bangladesh. I mean, interestingly, the growing salinity of the marshes and the soils of Bangladesh is causing a problem for water buffalo. So again, water buffaloes as a marker. And Nepal, of course, is famous for water buffaloes because of that one festival where every year, something like 2,000 water buffaloes are slaughtered. So all I'm going to say is that if the Saxena Center ever wants a mascot, please consider using a water buffalo as your mascot. As I said, this way of looking at food studies is relatively new, but actually food has been part of the public discourse in India all along. And there have been some really great writing recently about this. I mean, Benjamin Siegel's book, Hungry Nation, I think is an outstanding example of a book that looks at the importance of hunger and food and food policies in the 1950s and early 1960s. And that book, gives many examples of one of the realities of India, one of the realities that food writers like me, I think, need to remember. That, we write about cuisine, we write about the differences in cuisine, we write about restaurants, we write about the wonderful, luxurious cuisines that have been made. But at the fundamentally, one fact you cannot escape from India is that hunger is still an issue. Hunger is an issue, malnutrition is an issue. And somehow, it should not stop us writing about all the other types of food that exist, but we cannot ignore the centrality of hunger in our cuisine and in food in India. And what books like Benjamin's book does very, very powerfully is show us how India was born into hunger. We were born at a time when partition deprived us of the wheat of Pakistan, of the rice of Burma in particular, and to some extent Bangladesh. I mean, in the initial years, and there are fascinating stories about which have been forgotten now about how Nehru, for instance, was trying to get people to eat different types of food. So he planted sweet potatoes in the grounds of Trimurti House, and he took people, for visits and encouraged people to eat sweet potatoes. And all these histories have been forgotten because then the Green Revolution comes and floods us with food, and the hunger of the 50s and the often great innovations that were tried in the 1950s have been forgotten. For instance, soy, which we don't think of as being an important product in India. Actually, a lot of experimentation happens in the 1950s on soy products. And again, this gets forgotten, though bit by bit, stealthily through the midday meals scheme, soy and soy products have become very critical to India again. So these are all examples of the way in which food features in the sort of public discourse in India. But I'm just going to end by talking about one specific way which I have been writing a lot about, is the sort of vegetarian, non-vegetarian divide. Because this is a very perplexing situation where food is literally being weaponized in ways that are curiously distorting. I mean, we know the reasons for it, so I won't go into it. But essentially, vegetarian food is being weaponized as ideal. There are many examples, of at the National Museum, for instance, some years back, where the non-vegetarian food was stopped because it was felt it was disrespectful to all the gods and goddesses who are placed on display at the National Museum. In many states, the midday meal scheme, which is mostly vegetarian, but has an allocation should have an allocation of an egg. The egg allocation is being stopped again, and there is this constant valorization of vegetarian food. Now, what is happening as a sort of counter to that is that progressive people are pushing non-vegetarian food forward. I mean, the most bizarre example of this happened with a friend of mine. I mean, many people here know Ram Guha, who is himself a lifelong vegetarian. And when he came to Goa a few years back, he very pointedly ate beef for the first time in his life and then tweeted about it, creating a huge storm. And I love Ram. I revere him. I'm part of this community who call ourselves the Ram Bucks because we worship pretty much everything Ram does. But to me, that was a particularly stupid gesture. I mean, if you've been a vegetarian all your life, eating beef as a sort of political statement, to me, is somehow wrong. Because in the West and abroad, being a progressive means eating less meat. It means being a vegetarian, because for very clear reasons, because eating less meat is vital for sustainability, for the future of our planet, for reasons of animal cruelty, because of the extreme amounts of cruelty involved in the factory farming of livestock. These are all reasons why, very correctly, people are. It doesn't mean that you have to go vegan. It means that you just have to eat less meat, and this is the progressive position abroad. Whereas in India, this whole position is flipped. I mean, being progressive means not eating meat, but eating a lot of meat, which is daft. I mean, I can appreciate the political reasons for it, but it's still, all the other reasons for it are completely wrong. And above all, what I dislike about this sort of polarization, which is the sort of polarization we're seeing in so many other ways in society and culture in India, is that it misses out a whole central area. A lot of my personal interest as a food writer, as a food documenter, has been in chronicling what I call semi-vegetarian food. And this is, again, we are talking about marginalization. This is the food of literally marginal communities. It's the food of coastal India. You don't get more marginal in the sort of Indian geographic framework than the coasts. It is the food of Dalit and lower caste communities. And this, what I call semi-vegetarian food, is food that is mostly vegetarian, but includes a little bit of meat. And these sort of dishes are very typical to many communities across India, especially across the coast. It's through the monsoons, especially on the west coast of India, when you can't go out for fishing, communities depend on dried fish, dried prawns to sustain themselves through the monsoon. And they combine that with all the greens which grow during the monsoons, and they make incredibly delicious dishes of pumpkin with dried prawns, and a whole range of foods. Dalit communities across India have cooked offal meats, for ages, and partly because they were not allowed access to other meats. And these meats are combined with vegetables and other. How much now? Yes, I'll wind up. With other foods. Now, this, what I call semi-vegetarian food, is very traditional to India. It's very nutritious because it involves a lot of vegetables with a certain amount of meat, so that's actually nutritionally ideally balanced. It's extremely sustainable because you're not only eating meat. And this sort of food is disappearing. It doesn't fit into the binaries of vegetarian, non-vegetarian. Restaurants, which again, because it has a little bit of meat, vegetarians won't eat it, but it's not meaty enough for these hardcore non-vegetarians today. So restaurants don't feature non-vegetarian food. I mean, I live in Goa, a state which has an incredibly diverse history of these kinds of semi-vegetarian dishes. You will not find it on almost any restaurant menu. People come to Goa to eat meat, and that is their perception of Goan food, which is ridiculous. It's not. It's a sort of perversion of Goan food. So, to me, this is what I try and do as a food writer. I try and talk about the actual histories, the sort of foods that exist on the ground, what people eat, where the food comes from. And I find it's a way of opening up a lot of really great conversations. I'm really thankful to the Saxena Center for helping me to come here to help share some of these conversations with you. And I'm really happy to know that from Holly that Brown is actively thinking of developing a food studies program on the lines of what NYU has done with Krishnendu Ray. We need spaces like that, mainly because there are lots of great young writers who are coming up today in India, who are documenting, who are chronicling, who are looking at all these aspects of food writing, and it would be fantastic if there are more places like this to give them space. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be at the Saxena Center at Brown University, and in the very beautiful ancestral lands of the Narragansett Indian tribe, which is in Canada. We often begin with a land acknowledgement, so I'd like to start my talk with a land acknowledgement. It's particularly a pleasure because I actually went to RISD down the hill, and so when I was a student, I used to take courses at Brown, and it's wonderful to be back to talk at Brown. So I've got, let me see, I'm going to get this going. There you go. A lot of my colleagues yesterday and today, they've already gone through the history of Nepal's political history, so I don't have to focus on this. I will, however, point out a few key things that happened and how that relates to the creative life of Nepal. So this is the basic timeline of what's happened in Nepal. It's been a rush to progressive and democratic politics, and a rush to sort of progressive and democratic culture. So the main timeline that I wanted you to focus on is the 1990, which we've talked about before. That is our generation. That is what we've lived through, or what my generation has lived through. What I basically started to write about after I went back from RISD to Nepal. Right after 1990, we start the Maoist revolution. Within 6 years, we've already got a demand for the end of the monarchy, which had been an absolute monarchy for of 182 years before 1950, and then after that there was a 30-year rule of absolute monarchy again. So there, in Nepal, it's been a back and forth between absolute monarchy and parliamentary democracy, and basically in 2005, after the massacre of the royal family kind of weakened the royal family, but the Maoists also had their demand for the end of the monarchy was becoming more and more popular among the democratic flank too, and other progressives. And so basically after the king took over for the third time in 2005, the peace process that India helped involve the UN in started our current era right now. So the third kind of attempt at parliamentary democracy. And with that, as my colleague this morning mentioned, the Constituent Assembly was supposed to come up with what Nepalis really wanted was not just any old parliamentary democracy, but a sort of inclusive inclusive democracy. So a lot of the discourse around 2012 and before that, from 2006 to 2012, that was a very heady time when, Nepal is a very soft state. So unlike India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, there was this immense softness in the Nepali state, and everything felt changeable for a while. And so there were a lot of different demands. A lot of the civil rights movements were taking place concurrently with the Maoist revolution. So the Maoists, often made the demand for inclusion that other civil rights movements slowly began to take control of. So the Dalit rights movement, the indigenous rights movement, a lot of the LGBTQ movement, the disability rights, you name it, all of them, because we started so late. We started in 1990 to seriously try and become a parliamentary democracy. There was such a rush, and it was such a heady time. It was a very, I would say the country was in sort of intellectual ferment from 1990 onwards, pretty much till the failure of the Constituent Assembly in 2012. I'll go back to that. So because I am a writer, of course, my main interest is the rise of consciousness in Nepal. And, I went back from RISD, I was sort of armed with post-colonial theory and Marxist theory and, all of this to try and understand Nepal. And deconstruction theory, those were the big things that you go back from RISD with. So for me, I landed at a slightly more removed theory about what has been happening in Nepal. One is from the Buddhist concept of interdependent arising, which is that we all create our suffering together. We form each other, we create our suffering together, and we can also alleviate that suffering together. I mean this in a purely secular way. I do not mean this in any religious way. So that is very similar to the Marxist concept, which in Nepal, after 1990, the left really became a very vocal part of the political discourse. So there was a very strong sense that our material conditions shape us. I prefer the Buddhist concept of interdependence arising, particularly in a soft state like Nepal, where the state is changing us and we're changing the state, and everyone is really affected by each other in a very direct way in such a soft society. The other concept I work with now is the concept of karma, which is, again, not the Hindu concept of karma, but the Buddhist concept of karma, which is your mental habits. So you can change your behavior if you change your mental habits. And for me, in terms of the mental habits that we in Nepal have been in, it's very clearly the mental habit of absolutism, of sort of undemocratic, exclusionary kind of cultural habits that we're into. And that's been the fight certainly in my generation, is between democratic culture and this sort of absolutist culture. I'll just go back to that too. So in 1990, when we basically started the second attempt at parliamentary democracy, I would say that was Obviously a very massive change, but also in a way it was a power shift from one high caste to another. So from the Kshetri hill caste to the Brahmin hill caste. Neither of these are majorities. Nepal has a sort of majoritarian Hindu vision without having a majority. So it's a very fragmented population. I think the Brahmin caste is about 12% of the population. The Kshetri caste is about 15% of the population. Together they make a kind of big block, but they're surrounded. And actually, like this concept of majoritarian rule, which has taken hold of the imagination, I would say is, again, going back to this idea of karma, is a mental habit that Nepalis have got into, thinking in a majoritarian way without actually having any reason to do so. Writers, when I went back post-1990 again, the movement for democracy in 1990 had a moral underpinning that was led by writers, artists, particularly writers, but also people in theater, people in other forms of the arts. And in Nepal, so this is the one really cheerful thing that I can say about Nepal is we're still on a progressive arc. We've been on a progressive arc, mostly. I would say till 2012, we've been on a very strong and sort of rushed progressive arc. So, of course, the engaged writer, which, when I studied here, later, studied writing in University of Washington, there's such a vision of this individual person working on a novel or something like that. This is not at all the case in Nepal. It's a very collective experience. Everyone is reading everyone else. There's a very strong sense of a public discourse, and what is possible to say in public has been expanded very rapidly. So, writers really are considered public intellectuals. They've led the call for progressive change from 1990 onwards all the way to now. They're still doing that. There was a real confusion in the 1990s between Democrats and progressives who were all considered leftist, and particularly communists. So our mainstream communist parties were formed by Russia and China, sort of those intellectual histories. And then, of course, the Maoist Naxalite influence came in from 1996 onwards. So though that was considered progressive, but there wasn't a sense that you could be a Democrat and also be progressive. So there was this very, throughout all of the civil rights movements, writers who wrote against the monarchy or wanted to end, the monarchy were considered Maoist. And so there was a lot of confusion around what it was possible to say. And so I think a lot of the struggle, intellectual struggle in Nepal, political struggle, it was led by writers like C.K. Lal, who is a very prolific commentator who, if you don't read his work, you can't really understand Nepal. Khagendra Sangrola, another writer. Through their writing and through the writing of many, like hundreds of poets, it's a very literary society. Everyone writes poetry, possibly even economists. So it's a very loquacious society. There's a lot of intellectual ferment. And so a lot of this public discourse was being worked out through literature. And, a lot of poets, so you can make change, of course, as a writer through your own writing, which a lot of writers do. But there is another option available to the Nepali writers. So one, you can bear witness, you hold up a mirror to society. You say, this is what our society is like, these are the problems, a sort of critical stance vis-a-vis power. Or you can write more polemically. So that's all within the act of writing. But there is a very strong tradition of the sort of Tariq Ali model of the street fighting man in Nepal, and particularly among writers who have led demonstrations, who have led political parties, led the moral charge, and really kind of been out on the streets. So almost all of the writers that, well, maybe not almost all, but a lot of writers are regularly arrested. They are part of demonstrations. I've only been to jail once. Other colleagues have been to jail many times. And, I've only got beat over the head once. Others have really kind of like taken on this state in a very active way. So you can imagine that for me, formed by America, formed by this sort of bourgeois concept of how we create art, being in this crowd of writers, being in a community of writers who are so actively engaged in trying to figure out what are the stories of Nepal. Post 1990, we didn't have censorship. Before that, all scholarship was censored. We didn't really have a sense of the society, a sense of the country. We didn't know what the truth was. So a lot of the search that the writers community has been doing, scholarship community has been doing, is trying to find the real stories about Nepal. Like what are our real histories? Who are we? There are a lot of castes, there are a lot of communities who were not have discovered a kind of pride and have looked into their own history and are asserting their truths. So it's been this incredible gift of being able to be part of a community that is actively leading change. And that's something that I do not experience in North America. I do think it's something that the North American literary community really misses out on. I know there's certainly a history of engaged writing in Europe, South Asia, of course, and Nepal, absolutely. So a lot of the books I wrote were very much part of this discourse with other writers. So, the Tutor of History, which was set in the first parliamentary democracy election in Nepal, was really a search for what it feels like, because literature is the language of emotion, what it feels like to be a citizen rather than a subject of a king. So what does it feel like to actually have freedom? Seasons of Flight, another sort of huge exclusion that has happened in Nepal is, of course, women. Women's rights. In 1990, when the country became democratic, there were hundreds of laws that were discriminatory against women, and there still is one very important one that discriminates against women, which is citizenship rights. So Seasons of Flight was a novel that I wrote. It's a very male intellectual world in Nepal. The writers that are my colleagues, my peers, it's very male. It tends to be very high caste. That's breaking down a lot, but I felt that it was really important to assert the female body and to kind of just put it out there and to assert female agency. So that is a novel that is very centrally about a woman's agency and right over her own body. Forget Kathmandu, I wrote after the Royal Family Massacre, which was a time when all of us were totally confused. The Maoist movement was at a height. The monarchy self-destructed. Nobody knew what was going to happen. There was a real sort of existential confusion about who we are, as you said this morning. Who is Nepal? Will Nepal survive if it's not going to have a strong monarchy? Or it was only ceremonial at that time, but still that was part of the identity. Then how will it survive? So that was really my attempt to find based on the scholarship that had come out after 1990, to find a modern narrative about who we are. What is the truth of Nepal? To try and get away from, I grew up in a Nepal where we had a very propagandistic history, geography, education. Anything to do with Nepal was basically propaganda. So that was my attempt to kind of break out of that. And then other things too. So the one I want to talk about at the end is the citizenship rights issue. I'm working on a novel right now, which is about citizenship rights. I'm going to go back to the timeline. So I sort of mentioned that 2012 is when I think intellectual ferment of the post-1990 eras really started to falter with the failure of the Constituent Assembly, which had been, the aspiration was that it would create this inclusive new state. We would have all kinds of measures like proportional representation and quotas and federalism, and all of this was going to change. All of the language rights movement had resulted in a language commission that, said that these are all 123 languages are our national languages and not just the Nepali language. So there had been like so much of a reimagining of the state that when it failed in 2012, there was an election to a new constituent assembly, but even then there was so much difficulty imagining. This is my thesis, and this is what the argument I'm making here, is that the karma, the mental habit of authoritarianism, of kind of privileging majoritarian thinking, again, without having a majority population, but sort of privileging hill, high caste communities as part of the national identity, that they somehow just couldn't break through. So that's, basically the Constitution was promulgated after the earthquake in a very rushed, very compromised situation. And the main one, it made many gains. There is federalism now. There are some quotas and reservations in place. But the main thing that it failed us on, which is when I gave up my Nepali citizenship and joined the Canadian one, is the Citizenship Rights Bill, which is even now today being very hotly contested in Nepal. So citizenship is the place where the Nepali state is failing to imagine women as fully human and fully equal. They have created this extremely complicated structure where more than 5 million Nepalis are stateless because women are not allowed to confer citizenship to their own children without the participation of whoever the father is. So it depends on whether the father is cooperative or not. It's a privileging of the male bloodline. It's a sort of Hindu purity, an obsession with Nepali purity and blood, and this sort of all of the thoughts about blood and soil that we now, associate with this rising fascism around the world. So Nepal is really stuck there right now. Until then, it was a kind of, rush to progress. And I would say that right now, particularly with India and, China to the north, which was never going to be a big sort of democratic influence, but with India faltering, I feel like we're really just treading water right now. There's the citizenship bill will have to be decided one way or another within the next week or so. Right now the president is, we have a woman president. She is refusing to pass it because she feels like that would allow for a lot of miscegenation. So Indians come across the border, have little half Indian babies, take over the country. This is the vision that that is, it's amazing. It's millions of people are stateless because of this. So that is the topic for the novel that I am not writing while I give this talk, which I will go back to writing immediately after this program. But I wanted to end with a thank you to the Saxena Center for including the arts, because it's certainly the case in Nepal that the progressive movement, the democratic movement, has been led by the arts, and it hasn't been the other way around. It's if the economy has grown after 1990, which it absolutely has, if we have more rights, which we absolutely do, it is because the writers put their bodies on the line and artists put their bodies on the line. If you go to Nepal right now, if you go to Kathmandu, I'm planning to go in October, you could spend every day going to book readings, theaters, art shows, and talks, and book launch. Like it is a hugely vibrant scene in what is still a fairly soft society or soft state in South Asia. There's still a lot of space for Nepal to kind of break through this stalemate it's in right now. And so there's a lot of cultural work happening. That is the work of that's what we cultural workers do. And so I kind of want to end with a plea to the Saxena Center to not see culture as an adjunct to the economy or to politics, but because it can be weaponized, as Vikram was saying. It's when people feel things that they change things, and people feel things through the arts. It can be hugely dangerous. We have just been really lucky that it has not been dangerous. It can be dangerous, and certainly the citizenship bill, the debates around it are quite dangerous and quite fascistic in tone. So yeah, the culture, thank you for including us, thank you for having us, and please make it central. Thank you.
Right. So it's my turn.
Sorry, I should have taken that down.
Right, you just close this here. Okay, so it doesn't show. So I need help. Well, I'm getting the help. Thank you so much for having me. I think I've come the farthest. I'm coming from Bangladesh all the way. So 24 hours of flight time, 10 hours of time difference. So I'm, I would probably be sleeping in my bed at this point. But, so just bear with me if I'm a little sluggish in my brain. And if I'm crossing my 20 minutes time limit or 15 minutes, please let me know. I can immediately stop. So are we there? Yeah, so Marina Tabassum Architects, that's my office, and I am based in Bangladesh. So basically today, since our conversation was around marginalization, I'm kind of decided to show or share with you two projects, which has actually happened in the last 2 years, and to sort of, issues about marginalization and climate change. Can we dim the lights here towards the front? No, not the entire thing. I want people to see me, but maybe just the front ones, if that's possible.
The spots?
I think there is a possibility from here.
Yes, there is. I can do that.
Right. Okay. So Bangladesh. We all know where Bangladesh is located. This map here, where it's actually.
Sorry. This is the best I can do here.
All right. So.
The rest is in his hands.
Right. I think. All right. We'll just go ahead. So Bangladesh, if you take away the landmass, the entire area of what you see here is entirely crisscrossed by enormous amount of water body. And we have more than 700 rivers, and there are a lot of different kinds of water bodies, and there are different names for them. So it's really a waterscape rather than a landscape. So the entire idea of a landmass or a land culture did not used to exist till the Japanese and the Koreans and the Chinese came and told us that riverways are not that productive. You need to have roads, so build roads. So we kind of shied away. We looked away from our rivers and the riverine delta that we are, and kind of became much more city-oriented, and we started building our highways and metros and whatnot. So that's one of the cultural difference that you see. But one interesting thing is Bangladesh is actually one of the largest deltas in the world, as you know. 2/3 of Bangladesh landmass is actually delta. And we have 3 major rivers. One is the Ganges, Ganga. When it comes into Bangladesh, it's called Podda. And then the Brahmaputra coming in, known as Jamuna, when it comes into Bangladesh. And then we have Meghna, the other river. So all these 3 rivers converging into the Bay of Bengal actually creates the land. And if you look into, this is like 20 years of data of a NASA image, which shows how the rivers actually change their courses. And while changing the course, it is eroding the banks and also creates these sandbeds in the middle. So it's a very unique form of geographical formation, which is very unique of the Ganges Delta. And what it does actually in a real life is basically the land is such soft, fragile soil. It's all alluvium, basically sedimentation. And during the monsoon season, when there is water from the rain and also glacial water coming down, it has eroded many of the small towns, cities, and villages. So a lot of small towns and villages have been completely washed away by this action of these changing of courses. And it has rendered a lot of people landless, homeless, internally displaced people. You see that quite a lot, who has moved to different locations. Those who has the ability to buy new land can buy land in that area, and those who doesn't have the capacity generally moves out, goes to the cities, becoming one of the invisible citizens of the country. And so we did a research in the lower Meghna region where we traced these villages and how they have moved from one location to another. So when they move, when a village is facing this crisis of erosion, they generally move. So the movement generally happens, the entire village, including the bazaars and the administration, moves from one location to another location. And we've traced these different places through our research. And then again, as I was saying, that we have these sand beds that emerge in the middle of the water, in the riverbeds. And these are pure sand sedimentation during the dry season when the water current becomes much less. And the Ganges Delta is also predominantly, it's a delta which creates these sediments because of this tidal action. So the tidal action creates this whole enormous way of sedimentation in the middle of the riverbeds. And these sand beds are actually, in many ways, gives people a place to live. And that's basically an 8-year period, generally. So the way it happens is that first there is a sand bed that's emerging, and then there is a certain kind of ecology that takes shape, and slowly, until and unless the sandbed becomes a much more matured in its location, which takes about 8 years' time. And within these 8 years, neither the government nor the locals who doesn't come to claim it. And that gives the people who are landless enough time to kind of live their life off the land. So they do grazing, cattle grazing, and also agriculture, and basically that's how people generally live. And this area, again, especially the lower Meghna and also the Podda River, is very much known for the fish hilsa, the ilish mach, which is the most sought after fish of the Bengalis, very much culturally connected. I don't know if you know about this. All right, great. So that's again one of the major economy driving force why people generally live in these areas. So one thing I would like to focus probably from that research that we did is that map that you see over there. That's the cadastral survey of a certain area, which is known as Heimchor, let's say. So this is a cadastral survey done, CS map as it's called, was done in the 1800s, so 1880 or so. That's when the British started it. And this was it was done basically as the Bengal Tenancy Act. Under the Tenancy Act, the British government started consolidating all these lands, which are actually chors meaning those sandbeds, that we call them chors in our local language. So they were brought in and consolidated and turned into landmass, which used to be called as chors, which means that they were not really land, they belonged to the river, so they would wash away, or that had their own dynamics. So this was consolidated, turned into land, and because there was no ownership, this was then leased out to the locals who were then farming in these areas, and that was a generation of revenue for the East India Company. And one thing to show you is that this is Heimchor at this current time, where you don't see Heimchor being there anymore because it's in the middle of the river. And so what happened, because of that reason, is that this is the document which is from the British lease document, where they consolidated the land, and that's the lease document. And then when the British left after 200 years, they basically sold the lands or auctioned the lands to the locals. And so the locals bought them, so that's that. And then afterwards, during the Pakistan period, of course, this was just being handed down from one generation to the next generation. So the land deeds kind of moved on from one generation to the next generation. But if you look at the map of the site or the location of this particular land, which was there, and then slowly you'd see that it disappeared. It's not there anymore. And then again, there is a certain bleak of hope coming towards 2020 or so. So basically, the land moves, people move, but the inheritance kind of remains a static thing. So that's actually a very interesting phenomena, because this was an idea of a dry culture that was imposed on a wet culture that really did not exist before that. So what interesting thing is that while we were doing this research, and you'll see this kind of houses all along the river from the Brahmaputra towards up to the, let's say, the lower Meghna rivers. And this is a house form which is vernacular, but it is a knockdown flat pack system. I mean, before IKEA came up with the idea of a flat pack system house, we had that in our landscape for hundreds and 200s of years. So what people generally do is when they see a line cracking in the ground, they immediately start taking down their houses. So these are basically wooden frame, and then they have this corrugated sheet facades. So they take it down, as you can see, and then putting it on a cart or a boat and just moving it to a safer location so that it does not get washed away. And so, and after finding a proper location, they would re-erect it. So basically, it's a disassemble and reassemble kind of a idea which actually exists. And in our local markets in Munshiganj area, you'll find these shops where you can buy these houses, which is great. So, which is really beautiful, and you can add to that. So these houses would cost around $4,000, let's say, a little expensive, but I mean in Bangladeshi terms. But you can add to that. You know, you can add veranda to it. You can add 2 or 3 different forms, and then you can scale it up as you want. You can have a courtyard. So it's a very interesting house form that is something already existing. And so when this was a commissioned research that I just shared with you. This was given to us by Sharjah Architecture Triennial. And so for the triennial, what we did is we bought 3 of these houses from a local market in Dohar, in Bikrampur, and we shipped then all these 3 houses, these flat pack houses, to Sharjah, and we re-erected it. And in that, basically, these are the houses, and it's a beautiful house form, actually. And they have nice, beautiful details also. And so within these houses, we showcased our research work that we had done. But my concern during this COVID time, when there was hardly any work going on in the office, especially everything, all the sites were closed and not working, we decided to get this further, this research, and to come up with an idea where we can provide much cheaper, or let's say an economical alternative to people who are living in these chores, who are occupying these chores for, let's say, 8 years or so. So we came up with this idea of creating this form which is sturdy, lightweight, economic, uses local material, and at the same time can be assembled and disassembled within a very short time. And so this is a space frame structure. I know probably none of you are architects, but I'll just give you a very simple understanding, is that these are space frame structure which are supposed to be quite sturdy, and it uses bamboo as its arm, and we have steel joints, connectors, so that connects the structure, and it doesn't require a lot of foundation, so it can just sit on it. You just need a very little grounding, and then having a roof, and it gives you 2 levels, which actually helps people to have it wherever they go. So we call it khudi bari. Khudi means small, and bari is a house. So that's the term we've picked for this khudi bari. And this is a very, very important artwork by one of our very prominent painter S.M. Sultan, and we decided to kind of create a little bit of an idea that if we can take Khudibari and place it all around Bangladesh. So the idea of illustration, what you can see is that you can actually create small clusters of houses in the chores, if you like, or when there is flooding, especially in flood-affected areas, they can occupy the upper level when there is flood, and otherwise this could give them actually 2 levels. So the ground level would be something where they would spend their days, and upper level could be for their sleeping. And so during the COVID time, we decided to build one structure, which is our first prototype. We tried that out in Dhaka, and it worked pretty much well. So then we decided to take it to the chores in the lower Meghna region. And so it's quite difficult to get there, actually. So that's the site, as you can see. So first from Dhaka, you need to take a boat like that to go to the mainland, which is Chor Bhairabi. And from Chor Bhairabi, you need to take a smaller boat, which is that one, to go to the chor in the middle of the river. And that's the river. You wouldn't be able to see one side to the other. So that's the enormous scale of the rivers that we have. And that's actually one of the chores that you can see in the middle of the riverbed. And so this is actually a chore. And the river is actually up there. And you see a boat over there. Do you see that? So that's coming from the Bay of Bengal going towards Dhaka. So the horizon is, you cannot really see or actually comprehend the scale of these rivers. So here we built one of the houses that you can see right there. For a small family of a husband and wife. So we just tried out a 10 feet by 10 feet house. The idea was that we'll give them the structure and the roof, and the rest of it, like the lower part, the facades and everything, they will build on their own. We brought in the bamboo and the steel joints and the facades, which were built with local grass, tall grass that you can find in that area. So sourcing material from the location was something we tried. And this is again another house where we used 2 modules, so you can scale it up if you like. So this is a bigger family, so we use 2 modules. And basically the architects, volunteers, they go to the sites, and the local community who actually are living in these chores take part and make these houses. So this is again the 2-module house where we are using the tall grass. This is something the people also generally use to make the houses. So that's one of the houses. So here you see the details of the facade, how the tall grass is used as a facade material. Basically very simple, very easy to do. And people generally try to, and then the lower level, they have created this place where they can hang their clothes. And so it's a daily life, let's say. And so basically architects, volunteers come together, and then they go around the site and make these houses. So what we've done is we got a grant from the Swiss government, and with that we are trying out 100 houses in a few different locations in Bangladesh. And so the way it goes is it's a very community engaged project where we created this sort of a brochure or a leaflet where you see how the building is done, what are the possibilities, how it helps, and then we take it to the locals, and then the locations are generally climatically and geographically challenging locations, and marginalized population are our target group. And so we take it to the locals, and we show them, and then we start with the community engagement, which is about mapping their land and mapping the villages that they have. So first act is mapping. So once you do the mapping, we also have these small models which we try out with the community so they have an understanding of what Khudibari structure is all about. We have exhibitions where they can see the other projects that we have built. And then we introduce the local carpenters, so it's a kind of a knowledge sharing also. So we bring in local carpenters and then share with them the ideas of how it's built. And then you can see over there, there's a mass production of the houses because, people generally, it has to be, community has to decide who wants to build a house. So it's not something we push on to people. It's something people should come and tell us whether they want the house or not. So it's a community coming together. Then they decide that who wants to have a house. I don't know what's the time, but I'm just going very fast. Okay. So this is, again, one of the sites. And that's India, as you can see. That's near the Assam and Meghalaya region. And all the water from Cherrapunji and all the rainwater that comes, that actually comes down. And this is the place where it all gets accumulated. So this is the Tangoir Haur. Haur is, again, a wetland which holds a reservoir, which holds the 2 more minutes? That's it? Oh, my goodness. All right. So that's Tahirpur. So that's one of the places where we built some of these houses. So this is when there is a lot of water. And these areas are actually man-made mounds where these villages are. So you can see Indian mountain at the backdrop. And you see where these mounds, on the mound, one of the Kudibari is there. So in a dry season, this is what it looks like. So it's an agrarian land during the dry season. And this is what happens during the wet season when water comes down. And that's what you see. Again, this is one of the houses. So they basically have the banks protected. And then when the water comes up, that's how it goes. So basically that. Very quickly, I'll just show one more project, which is about the Rohingya refugee camps where we are working at this moment. So as we all know, the Myanmar nationals who has moved Bangladesh is housing 1 million refugees, though the refugees are, so that's kind of the map, and that's the Kutupalong area where this is one of the largest refugee camps in the world. And Bangladesh has the refugees that came in 2017 were not given the status of refugees by the Bangladesh government. They're known as the forcefully displaced Myanmar nationals. And Myanmar doesn't recognize them as nationals, so they're stateless people. And so they were given a space in that area, Ukhia and Teknaf in Cox's Bazar. And 2002, 2015, you can see that this used to be a forest land, which was occupied by the refugees, and 1 million people definitely needs a lot of logistical issues that are needed to be addressed. And so now with the Bangladesh government has much more, focusing on reforestation, as those were forest land. And so native plant and reforestation, that's how we got involved in this project. So I'm not going to go into the detail of reforestation, but we are doing a kind of lot of reforestation efforts. And here we also include the refugees in the whole idea of conversation, where we have workshops with refugees. We talk about the different ideas of why the plants are so much needed because of the macroclimate and everything. And we also have these community engagements where we, with them, sit and design the different structures that we are supposed to design. So we've designed women-friendly centers, we've designed child-friendly centers, we've also designed disability centers. And so it's always about community engagement, getting the entire program is developed with the people through these engagements, and then designing it. So one of the houses that we built, again, a kudibari for ourselves to live there. So right outside the camp area where we work generally, we've built a house, and it was done, again, through the same idea of community engagement, and that's the house where we live. And this is the forest. That's our house. It's a kudibari, again. Since we're giving it to people, we thought, why don't we live in one also? So this is a 3-module kudibari, and we have a stair that goes up. We live on the upper level, and we are generally having our office in the lower level. And we also work with the host community. So the host community are the Bangladeshis who are living around that area, whose livelihood has been affected because of the presence of the refugees. They had all their agrarian lands were taken up because to place the refugees there. So World Food Program, who's our client, has this idea of making these aggregation centers for women farmers who are producing different kind of vegetables and then selling it to World Food Program, which then goes to the refugees. So basically, that's an interesting model. And again, we have designed aggregation centers, and we use bamboo because that's a material that we are allowed to use. there are lots of restrictions of using material in the refugee camps. You're not allowed to build anything permanent, so you cannot do any foundation which is very deep, which actually allowed us to have a light structure with bamboo and steel joints, which actually helped. So this area in the lower level is where generally they sell their produce, and upper level is only for the women farmers to engage. So this is one of the days when they sell the fresh produce. They bring in from all different locations, so this is a kind of a hub. And so this is what it is. Yeah, I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
I am Ali Sethi. I am a musician and a sometime writer. I grew up in Lahore in Pakistan, and I now live in New York City. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Dr. Varshney and the Saxena Center for having me. What an incredible panel. And I just feel so vulgar and inadequate in the presence of all these super, skilled people who have made wonderful presentations on so many aspects of culture and existence that have been marginalized, but that my at least takeaways that continue to survive and endure and speak to us in powerful ways. And that's sort of going to be the theme of what I'm going to present here today. I want to talk about raga music, which is something that I had a kind of fascination with growing up in Lahore in Pakistan. But first of all, growing up in the 1990s, at a time when sort of both because of rising missionary Islamic fundamentalism in my country, and also because of increased globalization, the world is flat, arrival of American pop music and rock music, and then increasingly of Indian pop music, which was like American pop music through satellite TV. Raga music felt very marginal and sort of either irrelevant or not worth one's time. But I was very drawn to raga music because, and I didn't know at the time that it was raga music that I was interested in. My mother used to play. My friend Saud Ahmed is here, who's a doctor, and kind of grew up in Lahore at the same time as me. And we were talking about this last night, about how so much of the music that we learned as children, imbibed, absorbed, and therefore learned, because we're both musicians now, was music that we heard on long drives with our grandparents, who were of that sort of pre-partition generation that grew up in this very, I now realize, cosmopolitan, mixed up, dynamic musical culture. So, like Saud, I also, when my parents would take us to the mountains, to the Himalayan foothills in the summer, we would go in this car, and it would be a 7-hour journey. And my mother would play these audio cassettes that were inevitably collections of the late, great Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan's qawwalis. And what I always found so fascinating was that, and these were sort of long form performances, right? So each qawwali in these performances would average about 30 minutes. Each piece was about 30 minutes long. And I always marveled at how having stated the thesis, as it were, of the text, say the line "Aaj Rang Hai," right? The Qawwal party, which is like a kind of ensemble of about 10 or 12 singers, would each sort of contribute their sort of riff or their vocal variation on the theme. And there was a suspense to that. What is the young Qawwal going to do? What is his uncle going to do? How is this other uncle who sort of has the gravelly voice going to swat the younger one and come in and sort of do this other like crazy thing and like land it, and then Nusrat Saab will pick it up again from the... So this kind of idea of of suspense and resolution, of flight and landing, of departure and arrival. This kind of became, I became very, very interested in this, because what I could intuit already at that time, though I did not have the formal training, was that the enterprise itself was kind of paradoxical in its very nature. These were exercises in freedom, right? So like these riffs were extraordinarily inventive. The singer would go off into a place that you did not expect them to go off into. They would change your experience of time in the course of this riff, right? So I will give you an example. I don't want to just be abstract about it. This is better, right? So sort of if the main piece is now you have a right, the whole thing is going. As one amazing, wonderful Pakistani singer said to me in Punjabi, like, says even for sort of the completely ignorant of, those who don't know anything about music are also encouraged to nod at the, because all are welcome. So this sort of thing fascinated me, and then they would sort of sometimes change or introduce this like wayward note into the thing, right? So because there were no musicians in my family, how did they know how to resolve it? I was clearly an anxious child because I had a lot of PTSD apparently, which is why I was like, but what is the solution to this problem that you have created for no reason, You get to be free and you get to go off into into what felt to me like this kind of dazzling quicksand territory where you could, if by using the note incorrectly, you would fall off, right? And shame your entire family. So how do you know how to come back? As we say in Urdu, Hindi, dhang se, how do you come back soundly? Because it's not, clearly you're not following a formula of any sort, and yet there is some kind of logic at work that allows you to come back in. I listen to a lot of qawwalis, I listen to a lot of ghazals, I listen to bhajans. I would go to the shops in Lahore and ask for these CDs and audio cassettes that only much older people were interested in. And I kind of, the Urdu word is hifz karna, right? From Arabic, hafiz, to kind of to rote learn like you do scripture. I kind of just completely internalized these melodies and these riffs. And age 17, insisted that I apprentice myself. Insisted because I told my parents, I have to apprentice myself to a master musician. I have to understand this. I have to get to the bottom of this. And this is a... So, long story short, I spent, even as I was being an undergraduate in America in those years, I spent my late teens and my early and then my mid and late 20s inside these apprenticeships with two great musicians, Ustad Nasiruddin Sami of the Dilli Gharana and Farida Khanum of the Patiala Gharana. Both are musicians who were born in pre-partition India. Sami Saab was born in Delhi and migrated to Pakistan with his family in a few years after partition. Farida ji was born in Calcutta, grew up in Amritsar, and migrated to Pakistan at partition. So they were refugees for a while and lived in refugee camps, and eventually moved into houses that they had not built, and etc. And both, as it turned out, had interesting, sometimes painful, complicated interfaces with the state, right? Because they were repositories of this musical culture that really kind of came of age in what we call the late medieval period, right? And was at its most potent, its most dynamic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I didn't know any of this when I apprenticed myself. I just wanted to know how to resolve that stuff, how to be able to impress people like that and kind of sing and, sort of be able to sing in that particular way. One of the first things Ustad Sami said to me when I sat there with the harmonium, he said, "This instrument, by the way, is a total corruption and abomination." And so I said, "What do you mean? This is the quintessential Indian classical instrument." And he said, "No, it's a German instrument. Christian missionaries brought it to the subcontinent. And of course, the first to embrace this were the singing and dancing girls, because they had to travel all the time, and it was them and their musicians who, and this is apparently documented, that the non-classical singers were the first to embrace the harmonium and take it around, and it was prohibited. Use of the harmonium was prohibited at Radio Pakistan and on Indian classical radio until the 1960s, because it was thought to be the ultimate corruption. And why was it so corrupt, this instrument, or corrupting to our music? It's because, as Ustad Sami explained to me, he said this instrument divides our music into flat and sharp notes. So if you look at, I will not mess with that. If you look at any keyboard, piano, or harmonium, there are white and black keys, right, and notes. And that is what allows for musical notation, right? So sheet music is referring to these divisions and then to sort of variations around these divisions. Whereas the music of South Asia has traditionally been vocal-based, and for accompaniment we have relied on stringed instruments, because a stringed instrument can produce the modulations like a sarangi does, or a sitar does, or a tambura does, can produce the modulations of the human voice. And it took me a while to get comfortable with this idea that notation is after the fact. One is not thinking of notes when one is singing. One is sort of expressing and emoting and bending and being sort of magically fluid, and then afterwards you can think about what note it was. We don't go at it thinking, here are a set of notes that I'm going to now deliver or perform or hit. The idea of hitting a note is not sort of the way to do this. And Ustad Sami would do these magical, chimerical things for me and then kind of take it away. Genie lamp and then vanish, that kind of thing. And I would sort of go begging for more and say, explain to me. And he would say, no, words cannot explain. You have to just experience and then do as I say. So one of the first things he kind of demonstrated for me was what we call the Rag Bhairavi, right? Which is in the now popular imagination, people think, oh, it's a morning raga, it has to be performed in the morning, and it has 7 notes. And what are the 7 notes of Rag Bhairavi? Sort of go like this. Right? And our sort of do, re, mi, whatever is sa, re, ga, ma, pa, da, ni, sa, sa, ni, da, pa, ma, ga, re, sa. Right? And if I just spent the whole day going up and down the scale, sa, re, ga, ma, pa, da, ni, sa, ni, da, pa, ma, ga, re, sa, I don't think it gives you a very good idea of what the mood or sort of expression of the rag is. Right? Because a rag is not a scale. That was the other thing I had to really deal with. The sort of foundational text, or the sort of canonical text for accessing Indian classical music, is a book written by a man called Mr. Bhatkhande in the late 19th century. Very much a product of kind of the colonial period, the classification of things into this or that, into Hindu, Muslim, high, low, male, female, binary thinking. And Mr. Bhatkhande kind of is a lawyer who goes around, who's, very interested in music, obviously, and goes around interviewing musicians, and then comes up with this sort of treatise at the end, which systematizes Indian classical music, right? And his way of going about it is to say, let's divide all the rags into, or gather all the rags into 10 scales. And the word he used was tat for a scale, right? So this is a scale, is also a tat. So then Bhairavi becomes both a rag and a tat. Not going to make this too complicated, but Bhairavi is a tat. If this is a scale, then within this scale, anything that uses this series of notes will fall within this tat. So then Bhairavi becomes a kind of parent rag. And then all the other rags that use these notes, or some variety of them or variation of them, become related to Bhairavi via that logic, right? Which is a logic that's been imposed from on top, in a way, in order to organize it into scales, and thus hopefully to be able to notate it so that some like orchestra can perform it or whatever. And so, of course, many of the great gurus and ustads and ganewalis and, the great connoisseurs immediately rejected this whole thing and said, not only are we not going to promote this book, we're not going to talk to this man again. Because this is not what we do. One of the demonstrations Ustad Sami gave me, he said, look, I can sing Bhairavi in many, many, many different kinds of ways, including in ways that do not even fall into this notation of a keyboard or a... So, I could go Saga Pa, which is pretty linear, or I could go Saga Ma Ga Ma. So it's like, your keyboard can't do what I just did. It can go. It can't go. Saga Sama Dama Pa. So for me, this was magic, but then I had to do it with my voice. And I really experienced a kind of yogic sort of release doing it, really, because not only had my brain never gone there, but my throat had never gone there before. I had grown up with all this desi pop music that I realized was also relying on these chordal divisions, which were based on keys. So I had like several aha moments at once, and I was like, who am I? What is this? Where are we? Where is the truth? The other thing I had to immediately learn to live with was this idea of, a thing can have multiple etymologies, multiple provenances, and that's fine. Right? So Bhairavi is simultaneously related to the Hindu deity Bhairavi, and with worship of Bhairavi, and therefore with early morning ritual, and also with an Arabian scale called Bawan, which goes and both are valid. That is one way of doing it, and this is another way. And when you're performing a ghazal or qawwali, you can do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But both require a rigorous, immersive access. Neither fits into notation or into a sort of theoretical framework. Then I had to deal with, the Lucknowi way of Bhairavi, which is extra delicate because, the Lucknow people were very delicate, and that is why their civilization collapsed, but they gave us great music. So here is, I mean, all of that, right? So you right? So the Bhairavi way of the Bhairavi in Lucknow is Sagapa Lagat kare jwa mein chor. There's this extra half note. Mein chor mein chor mein. And the Punjabi, rustic, exuberant, i.e. uncouth, i.e. does not belong in the mazar or in the sort of darbar. How is it? Ba ba jo band ba jo band ba jo band ba. So I had to kind of become these different sort of voices to really understand what was going on here. And also stories about what happened to Bhairavi in our country, beta, beto. And then I would sit, and Farida Khanamji told me once, she said, for example, she said, because she came of age at a time when singers would make their debuts in the courts of Rajas and Maharajas. And she said, we thought we would go to Jaipur next, and we thought we would go to Patiala after that. And one of the Thumris, which is a genre of sort of erotic singing, a Thumri that we would present was a Jamuna Ke Tir, right? Which was a sort of in praise of Krishna, and would go like this, again in Bhairavi. Jamuna Ke Tir, Akeli mat jaiyo, Akeli mat jaiyo. Punjabi touch, right? Akeli mat jaiyo, Jamuna Ke Tir refers to the river Jamna. And she said we came to Pakistan. Our big boy sort of went to the radio station to do our audition, because we now had to be classed as class A or class B or class C singer. And she said, I knew my chops, and I went and I gave my audition, and one of the things I sang was Jamna Ke Tir. And they said, Bibi, Jamna wahan chala gaya hai ab. The river Jamna has now gone to the other country. You can't sing this anymore. We don't have Jamna. We have like Ravi or whatever. Like we have other rivers. Another story, the great singer Barkat Ali Khan, Ustad Barkat Ali Khan, who was a great singer, was singing these Thumris in praise of Lord Krishna. And Thumris are often composed in Brij Bhasha, which is this kind of deliberately childlike language, right? So the consonants get softer, and it's all about like what we call lard pyar, beseeching. It's a kind of beseeching language of love. Very playful and childlike. So Ustad Barkat Ali Khan was presenting these Thumris at this music conference in Pakistan, and General Ayub Khan had just taken over and turned up to patronize music and the arts, and sort of went into the thing. And General Ayub Khan was in the process of creating Pakistani culture at this time, right? Because who were we if we didn't have our own national culture, i.e. not Indian culture? And so he saw the great Ustad, who presented one Thumri, and then an emissary was sent. I'm paraphrasing and repeating the story as it was told to me. I don't know if it's completely false. Right, which is also fine in the world of music. It's like it's a good story. That's all that matters. So an emissary was sent saying, Khan Sahab, kuch aur. Like enough Krishna, now something else. So next thing Khan Sahab said, okay. Khan Sahab switched the rag, and then the next thing also somewhere it was, Krishna ke something. Another emissary was sent, Khan Sahab, something else. So the third time the emissary was sent, apparently Barkat Ali Khan set aside his instrument and said, Kya gaye? Muhammad Ali Jinnah meri baiyan na maro. Right? So which is how do I translate that? Sort of baiyan marorna and whatever is very much part of the Thumri language. Don't harass me as I'm on my way to fetch my pitcher of water. I being maiden, beautiful nubile maiden, stop teasing me and getting in my way, and what is this behavior? You're so rude, etc. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah meri baiyan na maror. So you know, Bhairavi became weirdly controversial at some point in the 1960s and 70s as we were trying to Persianize, you know, whatever. And of course, the singers poured that very same Bhairavi into Persian ghazals, into Persianate qawwalis that were performed for the organization, for the OIC, for the leaders of Muammar Gaddafi, who probably didn't, you know what a Thumri was. And Bhairavi sort of lived and endured and adapted and survived. And sort of, you know, took on these new avatars in different times. My last little anecdote is that I shared this yesterday. I also ended up using my little bit of Bhairavi in this song of mine, Pasuri. I was thinking, I'd written this part, right? This kind of, I think, encapsulates the whole, this little demonstration. I'd written this part, which is in a rag called Pilu, right? Which goes, right, and then gone. Now, having done that, I was like, now how do I make this exciting? Like, how do I resolve this? You know? And the Bhairavi came to me. Right? The very same sort of passage that I'd been practicing in a whole other Thumri, Khayal, Qawwali context helped me resolve this little thing. And of course, the moment I did it, I was like, oh, this could also be a flamenco song. Or this could also be a reggaeton, sort of, you know, like an Enrique Iglesias kind of number, right? Like, maybe you want me, you take me, you want me, when I met you, met more love. Does your heart ever cry? Do you met? So, I mean, for me, the classical did not remain classical. For me, the traditional did not remain traditional. For me, the Indian did not remain Indian and the Pakistani did not remain Pakistani. For me, the scale did not remain a scale. I got beautifully confused. And sort of the thing I learned from all of this was that sometimes bhes badalna, right? To kind of switch your mode of communication is essential for survival, especially for cultures that are marginal. And that is where the story of so much of our culture lies, actually, is in adaptation, in improvisation, in making do, making work. And that those are not just sort of political strategies, those are also eventually the source of our aesthetic sensibility. And that is probably a more fruitful, helpful way to engage with Indo-Pakistani semi-classical music, I don't know what you'll call it, I'll just say rag music, than any kind of system scheme that has been imposed from on top. Thank you. Can I switch this off without an explosion?
I think our plan was precisely this. What happened was to explode it all. and so this is why as when Prerna and I were trying to plan this, we wanted to go to very different directions, not just in the countries, but also different types of materials. And one of the things I think that for me stood out very much is that when we are thinking social scientifically, the question is how to put grids in order to make things understandable, to make them separate out in blocks so that we can actually comprehend. And the nice thing about literary and artistic areas is that we actually don't need to put the grids on it, right? So I think Ali's presentation showed this very well, but this is exactly true for all the others as well. Land comes and goes, as Marina described to us, and changes. As Manjushree showed us how closely connected any kind of artistic expression is to the political and social and economic life of a country, and how it is integral to it and not something As one person who was once teaching me language said that, grammar is not the icing on the cake, it is the cake. And so I would say the same thing. Culture is not the icing on the cake, it is actually the material from which life is constructed. And with, I think, food is the ultimate example of that. Our bodies are nothing but food, actually, if we think about it. So we exist through the cycling of food, etc. So I'm just incredibly grateful to the wide variety of things that have been discussed, shared, suggested to us. And so we can open it up for questions and discussions. So I think what we'll do is to take 3 questions and then allow our colleagues to respond in some ways, in whatever ways. So who wants to begin?
We exploded everybody's mind so much. There are questions. This is wonderful.
Grace, Shandan.
I think that's exactly what the struggle is what to ask of whom, that sort of, what are the threads that I want to pick up on, either speaking to the earlier panels or just speaking across all of you. And you've done a great job of exploding it all, so it's a little bit hard to do that. But I think it's a very random thought that came to me through all of this is we've been talking since yesterday about this need to sort of compare across regions and connect across countries in the region. But I think what you guys have said here as well is maybe the question that we want to raise is the extent to which we're connecting across fields and disciplines and the sort of work that's happening across this one panel, and also more boringly in politics and economics as well. And so much of that, I mean, my one random thought was just the extent to which our culture around rivers has influenced so much from our economics to our music, to our architecture, and to the politics of how, which areas have managed to get resources and which ones have become predominant and which then marginalize other groups. And so it was just, I wanted to share that with you across your entire field. So Marina, for you, and Ali, for you, it's very obvious of the sort of influence of all of this. But I was just wondering if there's other themes such as that you think could actually lead to more cross-discipline work across everything that you were talking about, as well, and of course the water buffalo, which showed up later on in your work, Marina, as well.
Okay, would anyone in particular like to?
We want to do 3
Okay,
questions.
right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I was sort of thinking about some of the things that happened, and none of you talked really about language, right? And this morning, we were all like, language is what causes a lot of destruction in the world, and yet when you talked about it, right, the food, wasn't about language. Maybe language is important. The houses, you were speaking Bangla, but that wasn't very important. So I wonder what language plays for each of you. Does it matter for you in your own venues, or does it not?
I think Ali is being harsh to Punjabi culture. Let me give you my story. So my deceased father, after he finished high school and did very well, my grandfather, whom I never met, said, "Beta, son, pick 3 cities in India," and we're talking 1933. "Pick 3 cities in India, and you've done so well, I'll fund your trip. Go away for 3 months." So I asked my father, "Which 3 cities do you think deserved your attention as an 18-year-old? Number 1, Lahore. Number 2, Delhi. Number 3, Calcutta." I said, "No Bombay, huh?" Lucknow is very close by. We were around that area. "So why Lahore?" He said, "Lahore is the site of artistic elegance, cultural elegance. And in your rendition of Punjab, it's the site of lack of sophistication."
Lahore is not Punjab, and Punjab is not Lahore. I won't say more. I'm just kidding. But is there a third question?
Yeah, actually, Prerna has the.
I'm just going to come in super quickly just to kind of, in a way, echo, first of all, again, to thank you all for like really incredible presentations and thoughts. But I really like this idea of, I guess in some ways when you're thinking about interdisciplinary conversations, there are many disciplines that are not here at this table, but one is really geography. It's a discipline I've been fascinated by because US universities, unlike UK universities, which is where you are in India, don't really traditionally have that many geography departments. But when I kind of loop back to some of those conversations about what constitutes national identity, Abhidit's point, and how I think, interestingly, national identity it's different sometimes for the people within the nation and for those outside. So when I think of Nepal, also Sikkim and Bhutan, it's really interesting, right? The two other states, one that was not to be, we think of mountains, right? So when we were kind of growing up in India, Nepal was mountains, Bangladesh was water, right? It was easy.
What was Pakistan?
So that's where I'm getting to. But see, here's the point I think that Karthik mentioned, is that then it became hugely subnational because, again, the population weighted mean is there's great subnational variation. My father's from Rajasthan, where it's obviously the desert, right? But when you I think topography is a kind of, we've spoken about food and architecture and build, but I think that there's something there to it, too. And here's where Pakistan comes in, is to me it's super interesting that I understand as a kind of Punjabi speaker or more accurately understander, I understand every single nuance of Pasuri and everything you say. But at the time that Pakistan was created, it's to me interesting that the references are, you have no Rabindra Sangeet, right? To me, it's almost like a kind of breaking down of regions within these kind of larger states that then also kind of further reinforces the importance of topography in some way by which, Marina and kind of any Bengali from India would have so much more linguistically and kind of geographically in common. And so to me, it's also a fruitful site, not just for kind of exploding what we've been talking about generally, but also for coming together in this idea of comparing across the different kind of countries that we've been looking at. But let's stop.
Can I speak to the language
Yeah.
question? Yeah, because since I'm a writer, this is the material.
And a translator.
There you go. So in Nepal, it's been an area of huge contention, language. So the unitary state, the monarchical history had imposed the Nepali language as the national language. After 1990, a language rights movement started up very quickly. And so particularly indigenous languages, there's the Indo-European languages and also the Tibeto-Burmese languages. Those languages saw a huge revitalization, a huge study, classification. By the time we reached 2006, we had a language commission that had recognized 123 national languages, which is a very different political stance to take in relation to language. What it did to literature was very interesting, because where we had this understanding that the Nepali language was the national language, that has been challenged. It's come down to being one of Nepal's languages, the lingua franca, the one that's used by the state, but it itself changed to democratize. It transformed from 1990 to now from a high caste language, a very formal language, into a very vernacular spoken language. And that work was done by a lot of writers who, Raju Syangtan, or a lot of indigenous writers in particular, who wrote in their regional Nepali, so kind of reclaimed the language as a democratic language. So that has led to a huge creative flowering. The other thing that's happened, of course, is that the literature in other languages has started up. So when we talk about Nepali literature, we no longer say Nepali literature, we say the literature of Nepal, because the Nepali literature is only of the Nepali language. So it's been a very, very creative ferment in relation to that. There's a lot of nationalism, so, the Hindi in the southern belt of Nepal, Hindi is the lingua franca, and so the state is still very nervous about all of the linguistic issues are quite emotive and contentious, but there's a lot of fight back and a lot of sort of democratization. It's been very interesting.
I mean, I'll also answer the language issue. I mean, Professor Pratap Mehta was talking about the issues about Hindi imposition and the resistances. And many years back, I wrote a piece called Kitchen Languages about what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, if anybody here ever goes to Chennai, and people from Delhi never go to Chennai. But if you go to Chennai, you should go to a place called Ratna Cafe. Ratna Cafe is it's a dump, but it's one of these like great Madras institutions because it's widely acknowledged in Chennai to produce the best sambar. Okay, the quintessential like Chennai sambar. Now the interesting thing about Ratna Cafe, even though it's in the hardcore old Chennai Brahmin district called Triplicane, it's actually owned by Haryanvi now. It's owned by Haryanvi. And the kitchen staff are all from Nepal and Jharkhand. The waiters are mostly Tamilians because Tamilians don't want to work in the kitchen any longer. They're prosperous enough; they don't want to work in the kitchen. So it's like in New York, all the kitchen workers are from Ecuador and like Central Mix. But what that means in practice is that this amazing synthesis is happening within the kitchens. I mean. Everyone is sort of speaking Hindi. You can understand Hindi because Hindi is a language that happens in the kitchen, but they also speak enough Tamil to communicate with the waiters. And we were talking about this earlier, that, on a macro level, language becomes an issue of conflict. But on the ground, people end up speaking. People learn how to communicate. I mean, even the differently able people, we was talking about Indian Sign Language, what the person who was telling me about the development of sign language told me what is most amazing about people who sign is that they find ways to communicate one way or the other. Maybe it's just using gestures, and they can, different sign languages are very different, and yet if you put different signers together, within hours they will have found a common way to sign to each other, or they will use technology. I mean, so people, on the ground, kitchen languages are where change actually happens. And you wanted to ask about rivers, and rivers are a very fascinating subject because, as you were saying, we underestimate the importance of geography. Clearly, for food, geography is critical. People think about communities and culture things, but it makes no difference if you can't access what is actually grown around you. Now, I live in a small state called Goa, whose image outside, particularly among people from Delhi who come, is that Goa is all about beaches, it's all about sea, it's all about seafood. For people in Goa, what matters are rivers, because Goa is bisected by these 5 or 6 big rivers, which have only very recently been bridged. I mean, until then we had ferries, and this is where one of the basic Goa music forms is called a mando. And basically, as our neighbor who's a mando singer told me, all mando songs come down to, I'm on this side of the river, my lover is on that side of the river. Boatman, how are you going to take me across? I mean, what am I going to have to give you to take me across? And that is basically all mandos come down to that, So, rivers shape our lives in geography. Prerna is right. Geography shapes our lives in really fundamental ways, which we just do not talk about, because the people, setting our lives sit in Delhi and acknowledge the importance of geographies in our regular lives.
Okay, so we are going to go a little bit over time, but I hope that's okay, so we can do one more round of questions.
Can I say something about the language thing? This is fascinating. I've been thinking a lot about language and whether it is relevant or the most relevant thing as far as kind of doing dialogue across difference is concerned. Because, one just assumes language is key. It's so important. It is such an important part of who you are and what you say and how you express yourself. It's also around the anxiety of identity. So much of it happens through language. We fight through language on Twitter every day, and we fixate on like crimes of language. And I quit Twitter 3 years ago because I at some point realized like this has nothing to do with me. Like I'm not in this sea. This is not where I would like to swim. Because I think firstly, what rag music kind of teaches you first of all is that words are irrelevant. Words don't matter. The first and last exercise of a rag musician is alap. right? Which is the aria, the part of the music which has no words. Even when you are working with words, so like you'll say Jamuna ke tir, right? The moment you've said it, now you have to break, to pull up, sort of loosen the consonants and loosen the vowels. You have to say Jamuna ke tira tira. You kind of deconstruct and dissolve within minutes of beginning the thing. So what you're listening to is not the word. You're not listening or experiencing at the level of the word. So what is being said is different from what is being expressed, which is different from what is being communicated, right? And so you kind of perform and learn to listen at all these different levels. And finally, I think I now know, because my music is on Spotify and I have American management who always draw my attention to like interesting statistical aspects of things. I love them. They're great. In case this is being filmed. But, like the music that is taking over the world, or that is performing the best right now, is not music that is lyrically strong, right? Or that is even like, I know I didn't mean to say it like that. What I meant was it is not music that privileges lyric, right? It is actually music that is more and more like limerick or nursery rhyme, if you think about it. Despacito, which was the song that really broke through the the kind of the culture wall, and that you had people in almost every culture of the world singing, right? Those Despacito. Now, it was like the Macarena when I was a kid. I didn't know what it meant, but it was a tune that taught you how to sing it. The moment you heard it, it was as though someone was asking you to sing it back, right? There was something limericky or nursery rhymey about it, where it kind of, as it unfolds, it's actually inviting you to participate. It almost sets up a chamber of, it imagines many singers. And it sets up a kind of call and answer situation, right? And so that's kind of the way in which I wrote Pasuri as well. It's fascinating to me that this is a song written partly in Punjabi, partly in Urdu, actually in gibberish. I don't, like many of the words, I just had to fill in the blanks, and I was like, what rhymes with Ramacha? Okay, Bamacha, like I didn't care, I had the melody. And it turns out most singers in the world, most musicians come up with melody first, and then they write the words. So it happens at the level of melody very quickly. It kind of builds itself. The tension, the story happens without words. And then you go around, trying to fit words to it. This Punjabi song, but I love Punjab. This Punjabi song is most popular not in Punjab. It is most popular in Assam and in Tamil Nadu, where apparently they have no reason to play Punjabi music, but they're vibing, as we say, and this is the word that keeps turning up in the YouTube comments. I just vibe to this song. I vibe with this song. I love how we're all just hanging and vibing here, And every third comment is, what does this song actually mean? It's not at the level of word, it's not relevant, and I'm kind of very happy about that.
Yeah, but it's certainly not the case with the Bengali music, I would say. It's all about lyrics, especially if you look into Tagore's song, even Kazi Nazrul Islam, I don't know if you've, but these are all absolutely about the lyrics. And also Lalon, I don't know, you should definitely look into Lalon, and the Baul songs that we have, the spirit, very spiritual. And they're all about the, very metaphysical, issues that they deal with. And also, I think I really agree with the idea that, every culture is unique because of its geographical and the climatic context. Geography and climate makes us who we are. Our uniqueness comes from that. All our food, music, language, everything is a product of our geography and our climate. Though the climate is going through a crisis, but then again, what has happened till date is about the location and how it has been. And so, I think definitely geography and climate should be a priority when we get into these kind of conversations.
This is sort of is a nice transition to my question for you, but I was super inspired by your presentation, Marina, Tabassum, I've looked at pictures of the Baitul Rauf Mosque and been inspired by that, but today's presentation made me think a lot about what's been on my mind with the floods in Pakistan and just the scale of the kind of climate devastation we're experiencing all over the world, but particularly in South Asia. And while you were presenting, I was thinking of a famous architect in Pakistan, Yasmin Lari, who came back from England and has designed many iconic buildings in Pakistan. And now she's sort of had a mea culpa where she's actually going back to Eastern Sindh, Tharpakar, and you're sort of trying to unlearn and relearn from a lot of our indigenous architectures in many ways that echoed your presentation. So I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit about this process of how, because in your presentation, it was not just about going back to an older, sort of these vernacular, but really sort of adapting them to the contemporary realities and climate change. So I'm wondering, what sort of takeaways, because in Pakistan now, the process of rebuilding, where millions of people now are homeless, we just need a different vocabulary to understand how to rebuild, and I'm wondering if you have some thoughts to share based on your experience.
Should I, or do you want to take this?
So let's see if there are any other questions, or especially if they're related to this, and then we can have this as the last. Okay, this one.
So I noticed that all these speakers are from different countries, different disciplines.
Microphone.
Oh,
There's a microphone
Recording,
right over there.
we're recording yourself. Microphone is necessary for that.
Yeah, all you guys came from different countries and different disciplines. So personally, I'm mixed Indian and Pakistani, and I'm in technology, very far away from social sciences and all of this. So how can people work cross-discipline in areas very different from social studies and probably international studies, that kind of thing, and still contribute to these kind of issues?
Okay.
I can't resist, can I?
Okay. Last one.
I know. As a primary organizer, I should be aware that it's 4:10, and
Okay, wait, so
if rivers have inspired so much music, Jamuna ke Teer and Ganga ke Teer, have mountains? If yes, if no, why? Why not? Huh? That's a question. And the second is a bigger one. I think I'll catch Ali at some other time. The relationship between Sufism and raga music. Well, that's a very long one, I think. So maybe the mountain is a. Tell me what you know about
You're from
mountains
the mountains.
and
Yes.
music. Mountain. We know that mountains inspired a lot of paintings. That we know. So.
Okay.
All right, so.
Marina.
Okay, I'll answer the question first. It's not so easy to make intervention into vernacular. That's one of the toughest things you can try. It has been tried for decades to give solutions to different kind of architecture, for flooding, for social housing. At the end, it depends on whether people accept it or not. And in most cases, people did not accept. And so that's why it's very difficult when you intervene into the cultural vernacular that already exists. That's why I think that the cultural psyche of people is important to understand. So you just cannot come up with an idea and just push it on to people. It needs to grow and it needs to come through an understanding and dialogue. Respecting the culture is absolute priority in these kind of contexts. Aspiration of people is absolutely of the key importance here. So that's why dialogue and engagement with people is more important. So we as architects, we have a knowledge of a certain way of building, knowledge of material, knowledge of construction. But at the same time, when we go into vernacular, especially when you're dealing with people who has a vernacular legacy, going there and trying something new needs to be through dialogue. And that's why community engagement is absolute key. The answers should come from people and should not be pushed onto them. because that's where always the conflict happens. So it needs to come from them, and we should be facilitator rather than giving the solutions, actually. So the knowledge sharing is important. What we have is the technical knowledge, the technical know-how. We have the experience of spatial layout and creation of space. Those are the things that we can try to contribute, but at the same time, changing the entire psyche or the cultural aspect is absolutely wrong. So that's where we try to be very careful when we go somewhere and work with people. It's a slow process. Generally, it needs to be a slow process. Otherwise, you cannot make people accept things. So that's why that's one of our learning experience, that you cannot put schedule on things. It has to evolve through understanding. So intervention into vernacular is one of the toughest and the most difficult part in architecture. And so, yeah, but it definitely, it needs attention, especially in case of climate crisis, where we see all these unpredictable, large catastrophes that are happening all around the globe, and also in our region. And we understand the fact that it needs attention, and for that reason, that needs to be dealt with, but it needs to be dealt with in a much more easy, with a certain kind of understanding where it cannot fail. Yeah, so that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you. So I'm mindful of the time. We're 15 minutes over, so we will stop. But I think this is a perfect comment to end on, because I think it brings actually all three panels together, that when we think of solutions or problems in all across, attention to the local, to the specific, to the vernacular, without that, nothing can really be built that would be long-lasting, whether we go economics, politics, or certainly culture. So thank you very much to all our panelists for traveling here and for sharing.
And I really just want to say thank you.
So nice.
Thank you to Stephanie, and thank you to Grace for really, truly. And just one last note, this was supposed to be a female-dominated panel. We were supposed to have a panelist who unfortunately had to drop out for medical reasons. But if you're in New York City, please walk through Central Park to pay homage to a powerful Indian goddess by Bharti Kher, who was supposed to be on this panel today. So I just want to acknowledge that and wish her a speedy recovery. And to invite you all to join the reception outside to celebrate the water buffalo is being officially inaugurated as the symbol of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia.
Amazing.